ABC Local Radio Queensland.
Well, the current financial crisis, as it's been termed, is proving to be unwelcome to some, but there's the odd ones there who have more measured thoughts on it. We'll be looking at some of those things in just a moment. You may recall that some time back, I think it was about a month and a half back now, I played you a recording of a speech that had been given in the European Parliament by the name of a chap by the name of Daryl John Hannan, who's a Conservative MP in the European Parliament. And he addressed Gordon Brown, the British Prime Minister, who, for quirks of the European Parliament rules, was forced to sit there and listen to what he had to say. The speech was so popular, struck a chord with so many people around the world, that it went what you call viral, and that is it had millions of hits around the world. Now, recently, ABC TV's Lateline Lee Sales interviewed Daryl Hannan for precisely that reason, that the speech he gave seemed to have struck such a chord with people. In this excerpt from that interview, you'll hear Daryl Hannan say that the stimulus work, the stimulus packages in the UK, has not only not worked, but actually been detrimental to their long-term future. I'll let Lee Sales from ABC Television's Lateline take up the story.
Let me ask you a bit more about the content of your speech. You say that Gordon Brown's stimulus spending and the bank bailouts have worsened the situation in Britain. Are you saying that it would have been better to leave the markets unfettered to sort this out?
Well, I mean, the problem was not only a failure of the banks, there was also a political failure. We should be careful before we go down this road of saying that the whole problem was absence of regulation. The underlying problem was that interest rates were kept too low for too long. That happened in the US, it happened in Britain, it happened in the European Central Bank, it happened in Japan, but that was a political decision, not a market one. The problem of subprime loans, which is, if you like, the gangrene in the little toe that then spread through the whole system and poisoned the whole of the banking body, that was not something that developed because banks took it into their heads. There was legislation both from the Carter era and then from the Clinton era basically telling them to expand home ownership. I mean, as recently as last year, the US Congress was telling Fannie and Freddie to make more cheap loans available. So it's important that we keep a sense of perspective here. It isn't as simple as to say no regulation was a bad thing, more regulation would be a good thing. As for the stimulus and the additional spending, I mean, I don't know how it's been covered in Australia, but certainly in the UK, there has been a rush to almost euphoric instant judgment in the aftermath of the G20 summit, you know, and the phrase you hear repeated again and again on the BBC is that, you know, world leaders have decided to pump $1.1 trillion into the world economy. Well, okay, where do you get that $1.1 trillion from, if not, you know, in the broader sense of the word, from the world economy? It's not new money that's somehow been sucked in from outer space somewhere. In other words, we're taking money out of taxpayers' pockets and dispersing it through these various bureaucracies. And you've just got to ask, is that going to be any more efficient than letting people choose for themselves what they'd have done with it?
Given, though, that governments always have an eye on the politics of these situations and they feel the need to be seen to be doing something, would any government in the world, no matter how conservative, be prepared to take a more passive approach and not be pumping money into the economy, as you put it?
Well, that was exactly the problem. That was exactly the problem. In the current 24-hour media world, the way the electorates are, it is a very difficult thing for a politician to say, I don't think that there's much that can be done about this. You know, I think the most pernicious phrase in politics is, doing nothing is not an option. It's almost never true, by the way. It's almost never true. But it's sort of taken on a momentum of its own. And so it happened in Britain, it happened in the US, it happened in Europe. In the immediate aftermath of these banking collapses, there was a rush towards frenzied activity. And voters initially warmed to it for very understandable reasons. If you've got two people and one of them is saying, I know, I've got the answer, and the other one's going, well, you know, I don't think there's very much we can do, your instinct very naturally is to give the first fellow his chance, you know, to see if he's right. The trouble is that when it turns out that he was wrong, it's too late to do anything about it, because the additional spending and the additional intervention takes on a momentum of its own. And certainly that's what happened in my country. There was a massive splurge of money, a really huge one. It didn't work. But by then, a political leader can't go back to his taxpayers and say, oh, sorry, guys, you know, that didn't really work. I mean, I've blown your money away and it's been... He has to keep doubling, like a gambler in a casino. Oh, it hasn't worked because we haven't done it enough yet, so let's spend more. And if that doesn't work, we'll borrow and spend what we're borrowing. That happened in the UK until we had emptied the Treasury and exhausted our credit and forced this extraordinary thing, which was the Governor of the Bank of England to go. I mean, he's normally a very reclusive character. He very rarely gives interviews. He was actually dragged, blinking like a kind of mole out of his hole, onto television to say publicly, look, we can't afford this anymore. You know, we cannot do another stimulus package. The coffers are completely empty. Now, that frenzied activity of the last 6 months is now going to be a debt that our children and grandchildren are paying off through higher taxes. You know, we have made permanent and deleterious changes to our capacity as a country to recover, all for the sake of showing that something could be done.
Daryl Hannan, that MP from the Conservative side of politics in the UK, whose speech or / lecture, perhaps that would be a better term, to the English Prime Minister Gordon Brown became so popular around the world. Now, you may have read in today's Australian newspaper that an analysis conducted by Fujitsu Consulting here seems to indicate that profit margins on bank loans have actually increased during the financial crisis here. We'll talk about that in just a moment. Chris Leithner is the evening program's honorary financial consultant. Chris Leithner is the principal of a private investment company. Chris, thanks very much for coming in once again.
Hello, Steve. Thank you.
Appreciate it in the middle of your Easter break.
You're very welcome.
Now, first of all, do you happen to know whether Australia is spent all that we have in the kitty yet? I don't think we have we? Not like the UK has. We haven't spent everything we've got.
Well, I think you're right in one sense that the Commonwealth government had repaid a fair bit of debt over the course of 15 years or so, whereas the British government had, in a very merry way, dug itself into a deeper hole. So in the sense of a debt hole which exists in the UK, it's begun, the Commonwealth government has begun to dig, but it hasn't dug a hole as deep as the UK. Now, is that an advantage or a disadvantage? Some would say, oh yes, that's an advantage because greater debts can be incurred and so on. I would say, well, gee, that's potentially not a good thing. Rather than continue to dig a hole, why not stop digging and ask yourself, why is it that these problems have arisen in the first place?
Your argument has been that the answer to too much debt is not more debt.
Correct. My answer to the problem, one of the problems in which we find ourselves is far too much debt, far too much expenditure, far too little savings. And the antidote to that is the repayment of debt, tightening of belts, and increasing one's savings.
Which is exactly what the federal government doesn't want, has been fighting against by stimulating the economy by giving cash handouts.
That is precisely right. But the trouble is that all the king's horses and all the king's men cannot put the borrow and spend Humpty Dumpty together again. They're trying desperately to do that. They're trying desperately to avert or to mitigate or to avoid, amongst other examples, a decrease in the price of residential real estate. A decrease in the price of residential real estate is precisely one of the things that this country needs. Decreases in wage rates are among the things that this country needs. But what is the Commonwealth government doing? Amongst other things, it's desperately trying to inflate those prices or to prop them up, both in terms of wage rates and in terms of property prices.
Now, last week, I don't think you would have heard this, but last week ABC Radio's current affairs program, The World Today, looked at banks' concerns that because of the first homeowners grant, what's developing is almost a mini price bubble at the lower end of the housing market in Australia. Today, it seems that profit margins on bank loans have actually increased during the crisis, this economic crisis. In fact, on each average home mortgage in Australia, the major banks are now making about $450 a year more than they were in the lead-up to the financial crisis. How can that be? How can they be making more money now? I thought things were tighter. I thought, it was there's not as much money around. How can they be making more for each loan?
Well, quick point is that banks are heavily leveraged institutions. In layperson's terms, what does that mean? Is that for each dollar of revenue, there's only about a penny or so of profit, which means that they're vulnerable to various sorts of changes. But to get to your question, it seems to me that they have loans which they've made in the past. Some of those are going to go bad. No one knows how many. They're making loans today. some of those in the future will go bad, the new ones I'm talking about, and it seems to me that banks have to provision. Now, emphasizing a point, no one knows the extent to which old loans are going to go bad, no one knows the extent to which new loans are going to go bad, but it seems to me self-evident that the number and the dollar amount of bad loans is greater than people thought it was a year or so ago, and banks have to basically ask themselves, gee, we have to provision, and one of the ways is to increase what has been a very slim and decreasing profit margin over the past 15 years, at least to arrest the continued decline of that profit margin.
Now, on the new mortgages alone, over the past year, apparently this increase has earned banks in Australia, the Big Four in particular, about $56.25 million. Mm-hmm. Now, these are now in the top 20 banks in the world now. Why do they need this extra cash? I mean, when people say, look, I'm really tight, why are the banks profiteering from the economic scenario when they're now in the top 20 banks in the world?
You're right in a sense to say that they're among the top 20 banks in the world, not necessarily because of fantastic things that they've done, because of great mistakes that banks in England and the United States have made. The answer to your question, though, is something that neither the government nor indeed the banks want to talk about. My suspicion as an investor is that the quality of credit in Australia is falling. So that
what does that mean, the quality of credit is falling?
That means the risk that people are going to default on loans is greater in an environment in which, just to give one example, unemployment is rising than it would have been a year, 2 years, 5 years or so ago.
So the risks are greater now for banks?
The risks for the banks are greater, and in order to cover that risk, there needs to be a bigger profit margin, and emphasizing the fact that banks' profit margins are thin. I'm not saying that in any sense to defend banks nor to bash them, but simply to say that banks, by their very nature, or modern banks, are very heavily leveraged entities. Not a lot has to go wrong for them to find themselves into strife, and that's been very richly demonstrated in the US and in England and in Europe as well.
The interest rate set at the Reserve Bank last week is now 3%, but if you actually go to your domestic bank to get a house loan, it's actually much higher than that. It's still at about 5.25 or to 5.75%. In other words, they're not passing on the full amount of the reduction that the Reserve Bank is setting. Does that mean that they are simply profiteering, or does that mean simply that they're positioning themselves to try and build their balance sheets as much as possible while they can? How do we interpret that?
I hope it means the latter. I return to the point that the quality of credit, it seems to me, is either stagnant or falling. That's to say the risks that adhere in lending are greater today than they've been in the past. And I'd actually make a step backwards to say that bad loans are written during good times. The best loans are written during rotten times. That's to say, at the very trough of a recession, say during the early 1980s and the very 1990s, the people who received loans are the ones who didn't particularly need them, whereas in the past 5 years, people, I fear and suspect that some of the people who took out loans which they couldn't afford, they made those because they thought, well, the boom can last forever. My salary is going to go from X amount to Y amount. The price of residential real estate can only rise. In other words, people made only optimistic assumptions, but when things go a bit pear-shaped, then we find that the risks were much greater than we had thought. And we may well find, in other words, the losses incurred by American banks over the past 18 months alone wipe out basically all the profits for the past decade. So in a fundamental sense, American banking has been a profitless exercise for the past decade. It's just taken us the past 18 months to realize, gee, the past decade or so has been a very bad period.
So Australian banks are making sure that they're not profitless, but they're profitable.
Well, that's my hope. Again, they don't tell me these sorts of things. They wouldn't announce them publicly in those sorts of terms. It would be because banking has come so politically sensitive. That's to say, it's a risible sort of a notion for a treasurer basically to stand over. Why doesn't the treasurer then become a board member of one of the big four banks? Why doesn't he dictate to them? Why don't we return to kind of a Whitlamite situation whereby credit is rationed? Now, on the one hand, to say that, well, that's a return to very bad old days, and I emphatically agree, but the government is trying to have their cake and eat it too. By bashing banks, they can, I presume, derive some sort of a partisan benefit. But if it transpires that the Treasurer, the Commonwealth Government and the Reserve Bank have been implicit in pushing banks in a direction they don't want to go, that's to say lending even more to folks, and you've mentioned the first home buyer scheme, if those loans turn out to be disproportionately bad ones, then who shares the blame? I hope it'll be the Treasurer who stands up and says, oh, goodness me, I was complicit in this sort of a problem, but somehow I'll be holding my breath and turning blue. That's simply not going to happen.
Chris Leithner is principal of a company, Leithner and Company, a private investment company. This is 612 ABC Brisbane, ABC Local Radio Queensland and ABC Coast FM. One final thing, Chris Leithner. Last week, the Institute of Public Affairs, the Conservative organisation, observed that Australia's current Prime Minister, Kevin Rudd, has increased the size of government to far greater than a previous Labor leader, Gough Whitlam, did in with twice the speed, or that Kevin Rudd has done in 1 year what it took Gough Whitlam 2 years to do. Should we be concerned about things like that, increasing the size of government when compared with gross domestic product?
It seems to me the answer to that question is unambiguously yes. And
we should be concerned.
My word, we should be concerned, and particularly at this particular time of the liturgical year, to ask ourselves, are politicians our saviours? Is politics our salvation? It seems to me the answer to those two questions is emphatically no, it is not. Are Australians a free people? Do they make their own choices? And do they live with the consequences? Or somehow can they say, whenever I get into trouble, we can turn to the government, but realising, hang on, to return to the government is to put my hand into your pocket and say, gee, Steve, I've made a bad decision. I insist that I put my hand into your pocket and extract a few banknotes to make myself whole again. Australians can't live in each other's pockets. That intensifies the various sorts of problems that Mr Hannan, the British member of the European Parliament, was talking about, rather than saying what is a clear-cut cause of our problems, having to do with far too much debt, far too much expenditure, far too much government. How can it be that all these sorts of loans are extended? He did mention it was at the, if not at the behest, it's sometimes at virtually a directive of governments. It seems to me we're intensifying our problem by intensifying the various sorts of problems that caused it in the first place. It's as if we've had far too much to drink on a Saturday night. We wake up with a hangover the following morning and we say to ourselves, the cure to our problem is another bout of drinking. It seems to me if we recognise that binge drinking is a problem, then surely logically it follows that binge economic policy is equally a problem.
Chris Leithner, thanks for coming in.
Very welcome.
ABC Local Radio, Queensland.